The cowboy thought the woman was just hungry for food, but her hunger was for justice.
Jonas Hale sat alone in his cabin as the prairie night howled around him. The wind dragged dust across the plains like restless spirits, rattling loose boards and clawing at the shutters. His fire had burned low, just enough to cast a dim orange glow across the rough-hewn floorboards. He leaned back in his chair, boots resting heavy near the embers, listening to the emptiness. Nights like these made a man feel small, as if the wide land could swallow him whole and never bother to spit out the bones. Then it came. A knock. Not the timid tap of a traveler asking politely, but a frantic pounding, desperate and uneven, cutting through the storm. Jonas froze. No one should be on his land at this hour, not in weather like this. He pushed himself from the chair, hand brushing the revolver at his belt as the knock came again, harder. He unlatched the door and the wind nearly tore it from its hinges. In the gust stood a woman, ragged, mud-stained, her dress clinging in tatters. Her hair, dark and wet, stuck to her hollow cheeks. She swayed once and collapsed into his arms with a gasped plea. "Please, food, water, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments." Jonas pulled her inside and shut the door against the storm. Her body was light, all bones and trembling. He carried her near the fire and lowered her onto a chair. She clutched at the flames like they were the last light left in the world. Jonas sliced bread from a stale loaf, poured water from a jug, and set them in her shaking hands. She devoured the bread like a starved wolf, crumbs scattering across her lap, water spilling down her chin as she drank. The storm pressed its weight against the cabin, rain pattering hard on the roof, the smell of wet dust and gunmetal drifting in. Jonas stood back, studying her. She ate with ferocity, but her eyes kept lifting, darting, not to him, not to the fire, but to the rifle mounted on the wall above the hearth. Jonas felt a prickle at the base of his neck. He'd seen hunger before, starving men, beaten horses, empty eyes, but this was something different. "What's your name?" he asked, voice steady but firm. Her chewing slowed. She swallowed, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and looked at him for the first time. "Mara," she whispered. The name hung in the air, carried by the hiss of the storm through the chinks in the walls. Jonas gave a slow nod but didn't press her. He poured more water, slid it across the table. She reached for it, fingers brushing the wood with deliberate slowness, not the shaking of weakness, but the testing of space. Jonas turned to fetch another log for the fire. When he glanced back, her eyes were on him, not wide with gratitude or fear, but sharp, calculating. She looked at him as if measuring, weighing whether he was a shield or a weapon. He set the log down, the crackle of flame filling the silence. The night crept on. Outside, coyotes howled low and distant. Inside, the air grew thick with unease. Jonas had taken in strangers before. Once, long ago, he opened his door to a man begging for shelter. By dawn, his wife and son were gone, stolen into a world of fire and bullets. He buried them with his own hands, swore to never again let a desperate plea blind him to danger. Yet here he stood again, staring at another desperate figure by his fire. The woman's hunger was endless. She tore through the bread as if it could never fill her. But Jonas knew. Her eyes had told him. This wasn't the hunger that brought her to his door. He moved to the window, parting the ragged curtain. Darkness spread across the land like an ocean. The storm had softened, but the wind carried something else, the faint rhythm of hoofbeats. Jonas narrowed his eyes. A shadow passed across the window, quick and fleeting, followed by the unmistakable thunder of riders sweeping past the cabin. He tightened his grip on the curtain, heart drumming. Someone had followed her. The morning broke slow and gray, the storm leaving the prairie washed clean but restless. Water dripped from the eaves of Jonas Hale's cabin, and a wet mist clung to the ground like a veil. Jonas pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the scent of damp earth and scorched cedar from the lightning strikes that had split trees in the night. The silence was heavy after the storm, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that held something waiting inside it. Behind him, the woman stirred. She had slept by the fire, curled in the blanket he had thrown over her shoulders. When she woke, she sat upright quick, like an animal always ready to flee. Her eyes swept the room before settling on Jonas. He saw the firelight in them and something sharper beneath. "You made it through the night," he said, his voice low. "Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments." She rubbed her arms as though the warmth had never reached her bones. Storm almost killed me out there. Jonas nodded, setting a tin cup of coffee before her. She sipped it with both hands, as if she'd forgotten what steady felt like. After a moment, she began to speak. Her words were careful, each one chosen like she was building a fence and didn't want him to see the gaps. My brother and we were headed north. Thought the trails would be safer than the river boats. We made camp near the cottonwoods 2 nights back. That's when they came. Jonas leaned against the wall, arms folded. Bandits? She shook her head, her jaw tightening. Worse, men who wanted more than money. They laughed when they cut the horses loose. Laughed louder when they dragged my brother into the dark. She swallowed hard, gaze fixed on the fire. I got away. He didn't. The words hung heavy between them, and for a long moment Jonas said nothing. He'd seen enough cruelty to know the truth in her voice. But still, something in the way she told it, measured, steady even through the tremble, felt like a tale recited more than confessed. He knew when a story had been sharpened. What were they after besides your brother? He asked quietly. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp as flint. I only need shelter 1 more night. That's all. It wasn't an answer. Jonas felt his jaw tighten, old instincts stirring. He had learned long ago that desperate folks often hid what mattered most. Sometimes it was shame. Sometimes it was a knife. He stepped outside again, letting the cold air clear his head. The prairie stretched wide, damp and shimmering, but it wasn't empty. In the mud near his cabin, tracks stood fresh. 3 horses, their hooves pressed deep from the weight of men riding hard. He followed them with his eyes out toward the hills where the mist hadn't yet lifted. The riders had circled the cabin, watched, waited. Whoever Mara had run from, they weren't done with her. Jonas cursed under his breath. He wasn't sure if the trouble had followed her to his door, or if she had led it there on purpose. When he stepped back inside, the cabin air felt tighter, charged. Mara was standing near the hearth. The blanket had fallen from her shoulders and her hands were wrapped around his rifle. She lifted it, tested the weight, the barrel catching a glint of the morning light. Her expression wasn't one of curiosity. It was recognition, the way a soldier regards a trusted weapon. Jonas stopped in the doorway, his voice low and steady. That's mine. Mara didn't look ashamed. She didn't even flinch. She just met his gaze over the length of the barrel, her face calm, almost too calm. You keep a good gun, she said softly. The fire popped, the only sound in the room, while the unspoken question hung thick between them, whether she meant to borrow it or keep it. Jonas didn't move at first. He just stood in the doorway, watching Mara hold his rifle like it belonged to her. The wood was worn smooth by his hands, scarred with years of use, and yet she carried it with the easy familiarity of someone who knew steel and powder, as well as breath and heartbeat. His jaw tightened, memory stirring like an old wound scraped raw. Put it back, he said, voice even but edged with steel. Mara didn't lower it, her eyes locked on his, steady, unblinking. The fire crackled between them, casting her face in restless light. For a long beat, the only sound was the slow drip of rain outside. I don't mean you harm, she said finally, her voice low, rough with something she was fighting to hold down. But I can't be helpless again. Something in those words caught him. For just a moment, Jonas didn't see the stranger in his cabin. He saw himself, years younger, kneeling in the dirt outside his own burned-out home, his wife and little boy lying still under the morning sun. He remembered the smell of charred wood and blood, the way the wind seemed to mock his grief, all because he had opened his door to a desperate man who promised he was only hungry, only lost. That man had left Jonas with a shovel in his hands and a vow carved into his chest like iron. Never again. His fists clenched at his sides now, as if gripping that vow, but Mara's face was a mirror of that same old grief. Eyes haunted, voice cracking under the weight of something stolen from her. Jonas let out a breath through his nose, slow and rough. Against his judgment, his hand slipped away from his holster. You keep that gun pointed anywhere but at me, he muttered. Her shoulders eased, just barely. She lowered the barrel toward the floor, but her grip stayed tight, knuckles white. The fire popped, sending sparks across the hearth. Jonas turned away. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. Though his gut screamed at him, he'd just stepped onto the same path he swore he'd never walk again. The prairie didn't stay quiet long. A sound drifted in on the wind. Low rolling laughter carried from the hills. It wasn't joyful. It was the kind of sound men made when they circled prey they already thought was theirs. Jonas stiffened, stepping to the window. Across the mist-hung ridge, he caught the faint glint of sunlight on metal. Riders were there, watching, waiting. Mara heard it too. The rifle in her hands rose a fraction, her body going rigid as stone. She didn't look at Jonas, but her jaw tightened until it quivered. "They're here," Jonas said, though he knew she already understood. Her lips barely moved, but he caught the words as if she had carved them into the air with a knife. "They're here for me, but I won't run this time." Jonas turned toward her, his chest heavy with the certainty that whatever hunger had brought this woman to his door, it wasn't bread, and it wasn't water. It was something deeper, darker, and it had just drawn death down upon them both. The sun dipped low over the prairie, painting the sky in bruised streaks of orange and purple. Jonas Hale stood in the dirt outside his cabin, the wind tugging at his coat, the smell of damp earth still clinging after the storm. He had seen dust devils on the horizon before, but now it was something else. 3 riders, shadows moving steady, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. The way they rode told him everything. Loose in the saddle, hands never far from their guns, eyes fixed like wolves who had already tasted blood. They drew up a few yards from his porch, horses snorting steam in the cooling air. The leader wore his hat low, his smile curling like a knife. Clay Voss. Jonas remembered the name whispered in saloons and back alleys. An outlaw who'd once worn a badge. A man who had traded justice for profit when the pay grew easier on the wrong side of the law. "Evenin'." "Hale?" Clay drawled, his voice lazy but dangerous, like a rattler stretched in the sun. His gaze slid past Jonas toward the cabin. "We're here for the woman." "Best step aside." Jonas kept his stance square, though his gut twisted. "What's she to you?" Clay spat into the dirt, his grin widening. "She's taken something don't belong to her." His hand brushed the butt of his revolver, slow, casual, a warning without words. Behind Jonas, the cabin door creaked. Mara stood in the shadow of the frame, pale, her lips pressed thin. Her hands gripped the rifle, but she didn't raise it. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was admission enough. Jonas turned his head just enough to catch her expression. Fear, yes, but under it shame and a fire that hadn't burned out yet. "What does she owe?" Jonas asked, his voice measured, buying time, weighing the ground between them. Clay's smile vanished. His eyes, hard and cold, locked on Jonas. "She owes blood." One of the riders chuckled low, tapping the barrel of his shotgun against his saddle horn. Clay's words didn't hang. They landed heavy, final. Mara's voice cut through, sharp and breaking. "He killed my brother first." The riders shifted, their laughter rumbling like distant thunder. Clay's gaze flicked to her, then back to Jonas, as if the woman wasn't worth the breath it would take to answer her. Jonas's throat felt dry. The air thickened around them, the silence broken only by the restless stamping of horses. The 3 men sat like a storm, waiting for him to blink. He felt the weight of the cabin at his back, its walls nothing but thin wood against their rage. He was standing between them and the woman, and in that space hung a choice. Hand her over and the trouble would ride on. Stand in their way and it would fall on him. Either way, dawn would bring blood. Clay leaned forward in his saddle, the dying sun catching the scar across his cheek. His grin returned, meaner now. "Tomorrow at dawn, cowboy. You choose. Her life or yours with it." The horses turned as one, hooves pounding the dirt, carrying the men back into the shadows of the hills. Their laughter drifted on the wind, lingering long after their shapes vanished. Jonas stood rooted in the yard, the sky bleeding into night above him. Behind him, Mara's breath came quick and uneven, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "They won't let me go. Not alive." And Jonas knew she was right. The night sank heavy over the prairie, a black sky salted with stars, the air sharp with the smell of wet sage and smoke from the fire Jonas had stoked inside. He sat across from Mara at the rough-hewn table, his elbows planted, eyes never leaving her. The rifle rested on the boards between them, wood gleaming faintly in the firelight. She hadn't let it out of her reach since the riders had come, and Jonas had grown tired of waiting for answers. "You're going to tell me the truth now," he said. His voice was flat, but beneath it coiled something hard. A man pushing back against old ghosts. "What do they want from you that ain't worth silver or horses?" Mara's gaze flickered to the flames. Her face was pale, lined with dirt, her hair clinging wild across her cheek. For a long moment she said nothing, her hands tight on the rifle as if confessing would steal the strength from her. Then she exhaled, low and ragged. I killed one of them. Jonas's jaw tightened. Clay's men? She nodded once. Her voice sharpened with every word. Not in defense. Not by accident. I tracked him. Found him in a canyon 2 days after he took my brother's life. He begged. Her lip curled, trembling between fury and grief. I put a bullet through his begging mouth. The words dropped like stones in the quiet. Jonas leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He had thought her story thin before, but now the truth bared itself sharp as broken glass. This wasn't just running, it was hunting. You brought them on your trail, Jonas said. Straight to my door. Her eyes lifted to his, and in them burned a fever that no bread or water could have cured. I won't stop until they're all buried. The words shook with conviction, her voice fierce, alive. Every last one of them. You think I came here looking for pity? No. I came because I need time to reload. Time to breathe before I keep going. Jonas stared at her, the old ache in his chest stirring again. He had buried vengeance once, swore it would never root in him, but he saw it growing wild in her like a fire that would burn everything it touched. He didn't know if he should shield her or stop her before she dragged them both into hell. He rubbed a hand over his face, weary. Revenge don't fill the hunger, Mara, it just makes it deeper. Her grip on the rifle tightened. Better hungry than helpless. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Jonas turned his head, listening past the walls. The prairie was never still. He knew that. But the sound that reached him now was wrong. An edge in the wind. Faint voices carried close. Before he could rise, something whistled through the air. A sudden thud rattled the roof, followed by the hiss of fire spreading across dry wood. The smell of pitch filled the cabin as orange glow bled through the rafters. A torch had landed on the cabin. Clay's men had come early. Flames spread fast across the dry roof beams, a hungry crackle that swallowed the cabin in minutes. Smoke poured down from the rafters, thick and choking, stinging Jonas Hale's eyes as sparks rained around him. He yanked Mara by the arm, pulling her toward the door just as a bullet shattered the window and sprayed glass across the floor. Another shot punched through the wall, the thud of lead close enough to make the air snap. Move, Jonas barked, shoving her ahead of him. They burst into the night air, coughing, the heat from the burning cabin washing their backs as fire licked up into the dark. Gunfire followed them. The outlaws had closed in under the cover of night, their torches bobbing like phantom lights on the ridge. Bullets sparked off the iron pump by the well, ripped into the woodpile. Jonas pulled Mara low behind the trough. She was gasping, hair wild against her face, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than fear. Without hesitation, she snatched up the rifle, braced it against the trough, and returned fire. The crack of the shot split the night. One of the riders yelped as his horse reared, throwing him hard into the dirt. Jonas blinked. The way she handled that rifle wasn't desperate guesswork. It was skill. Calculated, sure, steady. She fired again, quick as lightning, forcing the others to pull their horses back behind the line of cottonwoods. You said you couldn't be helpless, Jonas muttered, smoke stinging his throat. Looks to me like you never were. She didn't glance at him. I don't need saving, Jonas. I need a partner. Her words cut clean, sharp, leaving no space for argument. She chambered another round and aimed into the trees where the torchlight flickered. Jonas's gut twisted. He had expected to drag her from danger, to shield her, but now he saw the truth. She wasn't running from men, she was hunting them. And he was caught in the middle of her war. The cabin roared behind them, collapsing in on itself with a groan of beams. Smoke and fire bled into the night sky, the flames a beacon calling every set of eyes for miles. Jonas cursed under his breath. They had to move or be swallowed whole. Come on, he growled, grabbing her by the arm again. She jerked free only long enough to sling the rifle over her shoulder, then followed him as they ducked through the tall grass toward the ravine, cut deep by spring rains. Gunfire snapped at their heels, but the land swallowed them in shadows as they slid down the steep bank into the hollow below. Both dropped into the dirt, chests heaving, lungs burning from smoke and the run. For a moment there was silence except for the faint crackle of fire above, and the distant shouts of the men regrouping. Jonas turned to her, his voice low but sharp. This isn't survival anymore. This is slaughter. Mara's head snapped toward him, sweat and ash streaking her face, eyes blazing in the dim light. Out here, survival and justice are the same thing. You want to live, you fight. You want the dead to rest, you fight harder. Jonas stared at her, the words burning through him. In the flickering firelight cast down the ravine, he saw his wife's face again. The way she had smiled before the stranger's betrayal, the way she had fallen when the bullets came. He had vowed never again, never to let vengeance drag him into hell. And yet here he was, staring at a woman who bore the same fire, asking him to step into it beside her. The ground trembled faintly with hoofbeats above. Shadows shifted on the ridge. One outlaw leaned too far over the edge, a silhouette against the glow of the fire. Mara's rifle rose, her body snapping into deadly focus. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. A scream followed, high and sharp, a dying cry that carried across the ravine before it was swallowed by the night. The outlaw's body tumbled from the ridge, striking rocks as it rolled into the darkness below. Jonas closed his eyes, the echo of the man's death mingling with the roar of fire and the hammer of his own heart. The war had already begun, and he had to decide whether he would keep running from it or stand inside its flames. The first pale light of dawn crept over the rim of the ravine, turning the ash and smoke of the night into a thin blue haze. Jonas Hale crouched beside the crumpled body of the man Mara had shot down. The outlaw's eyes stared blankly at the sky, his neck bent at an unnatural angle where the rocks had broken his fall. Blood pooled dark beneath him, soaking into the dirt. Jonas's breath came slow, heavy, each exhale tasting of soot and iron. He should have walked away. He should have let the dead lie where they fell, but something nagged at him, a pull stronger than his own disgust. He reached for the man's vest, pushing past the stiffening leather, searching for anything that would tell him who these men truly were. His fingers brushed metal. Cold, round, familiar. Jonas drew it out and froze. It was a badge. Tarnished, scarred, but unmistakable. A U.S. Marshal's star. For a long moment he simply stared at it, the edges catching the faint light of dawn. Not stolen. Not counterfeit. Worn smooth on the back where it had pressed for years against a man's chest with pride. This outlaw, this predator they had just buried in dirt and stone, had once been a lawman sworn to protect. Jonas felt a hollow pit open inside him. He had known Clay Voss's name, whispered in the saloons as a man gone bad. But Clay's riders weren't common bandits. They had once worn authority, carried the weight of justice, and now they twisted it into something monstrous. He looked up at Mara. She stood a few paces off, the rifle slung over her shoulder, her face drawn and pale in the new light. She watched him but said nothing. She didn't need to. The fire in her eyes told him she had known all along. They were law, Jonas said, his voice rough. He held the badge up, the metal trembling in his hand. Marshals, Mara's expression didn't change. They killed my brother in the name of that badge. They used it to take what they wanted. Her jaw set. That's not law. That's rot. Jonas looked back down at the body. The badge gleamed dull in his palm, and the weight of it pressed heavier than iron. Justice itself was spoiled out here, bent into something unrecognizable. Maybe Mara's vengeance was blood-soaked, but these men she hunted were no innocent victims. They had traded their oath for cruelty, traded the star for fear. Jonas turned the badge over once more before standing. He wiped the dirt from his hands, his heart heavier than the sky above. The ground trembled faintly, a rhythm carried on the dawn air. Hoofbeats, steady, deliberate, drawing closer. A shadow rose against the ridge, broad shoulders mounted on a dark horse, Clay Voss himself framed by the rising sun. He rode slow into the ravine, his hat brim low, his eyes catching Jonas like steel traps. Behind him, two more riders followed, rifles in hand. Clay's grin was thin, cruel, his voice carrying across the hollow. Step aside, Hale, this ain't your quarrel. The girl kneels before me or you die with her. Jonas lifted the badge high, letting the dawn light catch it. His heart hammered in his chest, the weight of decision pressing down harder than the badge itself. Mara stood rigid beside him, rifle ready, her breath shallow but unbroken. The ravine held its breath as Clay's words hung in the air, sharp as a noose tightening. The morning sun beat down on the dusty main street of the frontier town, its rays slicing through the lingering haze of smoke from chimneys and cooking fires. Wagons creaked, merchants set out their wares, children darted between horses' legs. It should have been an ordinary day. But the rhythm of the town stilled when Clay Voss rode in at the head of his men, dragging Jonas Hale and Mara like captured game. Jonas's hands were bound, his face streaked with soot and blood. Mara walked beside him, her wrists tied yet her head unbowed, eyes blazing even under the weight of ropes. Clay's voice rang out as he pulled his horse to a halt in the middle of the street. "Gather round, folks. Justice has come back to town." His sneer stretched wide, and the sound of spurs and boots drew townsfolk into the square. Windows creaked open, shopkeepers stepped outside, and the blacksmith wiped soot from his brow to watch. Clay raised a hand toward Mara, yanking her forward so she stumbled in the dirt. "This woman here is a murderer. Took the life of one of my men, a lawman no less. And this one..." He shoved Jonas with the barrel of his revolver, forcing him to his knees. "This fool sheltered her, helped her run. You all know what that makes him." The crowd murmured, confusion and unease rippling through them. They knew Clay, knew the grip his riders had on the roads and the saloons. Some faces showed doubt, others fear. No one spoke. Clay let the silence stretch, feeding on it. Jonas's chest heaved as he drew breath through cracked lips. He rose slowly to his feet despite the ropes, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. Then from his pocket he pulled out the tarnished badge he had taken from the dead man in the ravine. It caught the sunlight, flashing bright. "They wore law once," Jonas said, his voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. His words rolled steady, low, but strong enough to carry. "But you all know what they wear now. Evil. These men don't bring justice. They bring fear. And the only crime left in this town is letting them rule you with it." Gasps broke from the crowd. A shopkeeper near the edge shouted, his voice trembling. "Clay's bled me dry for 2 winters straight. Called it a tax for protection." Another voice rose, an older woman clutching her shawl. "My boy, they broke his ribs when he couldn't pay. Said it was the law teaching him respect." Murmurs spread like wildfire, the tide turning in whispers and accusations, heads nodding, eyes hardening. Clay's sneer twisted into fury. He jerked his revolver from its holster, waving it at the crowd to shut them up. "Enough!" His voice cracked with anger, with panic. "You listen to me or you'll hang with them." But the moment had already slipped from his grip. Jonas's hand moved faster than thought, the iron weight of his own pistol drawn with the reflex of a man who had lived too long on the edge. One shot rang out. The crack echoed down the street, scattering birds from the rooftops. Clay's eyes went wide, the sneer dying on his lips as the bullet tore through him. He toppled from the saddle, hitting the dust with a heavy thud. Silence fell. Smoke drifted from Jonas's revolver, his chest rising and falling like a man who had just laid down years of ghosts in a single breath. The crowd didn't move at first, stunned as the dust began to settle around Clay's body. Then slowly, one by one, they stepped forward. The blacksmith gripped his hammer tight. The shopkeeper clenched his fists. A dozen men and women surrounded the remaining riders, their faces no longer cowed but sharpened with rage and resolve. Mara fell to her knees in the dirt. The ropes around her wrists loosened under her trembling hands. She stared at Clay's body, at the circle of townsfolk rising like a tide, and for the first time since Jonas had opened his cabin door to her, her eyes softened. The hunger that had driven her, gnawing, merciless, unending, seemed to falter. Not for food, not even for vengeance, but for justice. Jonas stood in the sunlight, soot-stained and scarred, watching as the town closed in on its tormentors. For once, the weight of the badge in his pocket felt lighter, and beside him Mara bowed her head, her fire finally quieted by the sight of justice done. The land was quiet again. Days had passed since the fire and the blood, but the echoes of it all still clung to the wind. Jonas Hale stood where his cabin once had been, boots sinking in the blackened soil. The timbers were charred, the walls gone to ash, yet he worked with steady hands, setting new beams, driving nails into fresh boards. Smoke still lingered in the woodpile, but it no longer carried threat, only memory. Each hammer strike was a heartbeat. Each board laid a prayer for the dead he'd long carried with him. Mara stood a few paces off, her horse saddled, her pack tied down. She watched him with that same sharpness she had carried since the night she'd staggered into his life, though now it was softened, tempered by all that had been burned away. The rifle still hung across her shoulder, but the way she held it had changed. Not like a lifeline, more like a burden she knew she would carry, but perhaps could set down someday. She stepped closer, boots crunching over the brittle ash. "You've got work ahead of you." Jonas nodded, driving another nail home. "Work's the only thing keeps the ghosts quiet." They stood in silence a long while, the prairie stretching endless around them, the sky wide and merciless above. At last Mara drew a slow breath and said, "Thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried weight. not just for the shelter or the stand he had taken, but for the way he had seen her, not just as a fugitive, not just as hunger on two legs, but as a soul caught in the fire. Jonas set the hammer down and looked at her, eyes steady, lined with years. Don't let vengeance eat what's left of you. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. For the first time since he'd known her, a hint of a smile touched her lips, worn, fragile, but real. Maybe hunger fades once it's fed right. She mounted her horse, leather creaking, and turned toward the open horizon. The morning light caught her figure as she rode, her shadow long on the ground, stretching into the unknown. She didn't look back, but Jonas knew she carried the weight of everything they had faced. The sound of hoofbeats grew faint, then vanished into the wind. Jonas stood alone once more, the prairie wind tugging at his coat, carrying with it both dust and silence. Justice had been paid, but never without cost. He looked down at the tarnished marshal's badge in his hand, scorched and bent from fire, yet still gleaming faintly in the sun. Slowly, he raised it and nailed it above the new doorway he was building. It wasn't a symbol of law anymore. It wasn't even a symbol of vengeance. It was a reminder, a thin line drawn in iron between justice and corruption, survival and damnation. Jonas stepped back, eyes narrowing at the star against the wood. Then he picked up his hammer again and went back to work, the rhythm of rebuilding steady in the vast silence of the plains.